Thanks everyone for attending the National Farmers Union's webinar series NF University. Our presenter today is Dr. Miguel Altieri, and the topic is agroecology, scaling up sustainable farming for a planet in polycrisis. It is my great honor to introduce our speaker. Dr. Miguel Altieri is a leading figure in agroecology. He holds a Ph.D. in entomology from the University of Florida, and he has served as Professor of Agroecology at UC Berkeley for 37 years and is now Professor Emeritus. Dr. Altieri has extensively researched and promoted agroecology in California, Latin America, and elsewhere, collaborating closely with farmers. He has advised organizations such as CLAIDS Chile and the United Nations Sustainable Agriculture Networking and Extension Program. He's received numerous honors, including honorary doctorates and induction into the Earth Hall of Fame. He has authored over 250 scientific articles and 40 books, most on agroecology. Dr. Altieri currently co-directs the Centro Latinoamericano, Centro Latinoamericano de Investigaciones Agroecológicas, and runs an agroecological project in Colombia with his wife. He continues to teach at various universities globally. Please go ahead, Dr. Altieri.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you, to this group of NFU on agroecology. I'm going to ask my wife here to help me share the screen. Thank you very much. So we're facing a polycrisis at the planetary level in which we have several crises affecting the planet in synchronicity: climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics, armed conflicts, economic crisis, food crisis, and a public health crisis, as it happened with COVID-19. And what's interesting is that these global problems of energy shortages, water scarcity, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, etc., food insecurity, cannot be addressed in isolation because these problems are systemic and they're interconnected and interdependent. When one of the problems is aggravated, the effects spread throughout the system, exacerbating other problems. And this is why, for example, climate change and COVID and biodiversity loss, when they come together, they aggravate each other, and it's like a vicious circle. So at this moment of ecological and economic rupture, the pandemic and climate change constitute a manifestation of a cascade of catastrophes that will impact humanity as long as the economic model, the capitalist model, extractive and consuming patterns persist. And the rapid expansion of industrial agriculture and its disruption of wild ecosystem is part of this cascade, which is imposing a huge ecological toll on the planet. In fact, agriculture is contributing to transcend the planetary boundaries, where humanity has a safe space, but we can see that now agriculture is contributing to climate change, to loss of biodiversity, to injecting novel chemicals into the environment, in land use changes, etc., which are irreversible, which are processes that are already past the tipping point, and they are actually irreversible. So we need to adapt to climate change because climate change is already happening, biodiversity loss, etc., etc. So agriculture has become a major force of modification of the biosphere. Yeah, there is 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture in the world, and 80% of this agricultural landscape is covered by homogeneous monocultures that are very, very, very dependent on external inputs, that they are very susceptible to pests, diseases, and weeds, and also to climate change because of their ecological homogeneity, and lack of ecological regulation mechanisms. So as we see today, the less species we have at the landscape level, the higher the risk of harvest loss. So for example, Canada in certain, or United States, the Midwest of the United States would be around here, around 1 or 2 species dominated in landscape. Therefore, the probability of losing the harvest due to pest or climate change or other problems is very, very high. As we increase, however, the crop diversity at the landscape level, then this risk become less and less as we increase the diversity. So despite the fact that we could be eating more than 250,000 species of plants, actually only 3 crops, corn, wheat, and rice, provide 50% of the human food, because the global system, the global food system, has actually favored through policies and through other economic forces these 3 crops, which dominate the landscapes of the world. And therefore, most of these crops are impressively uniform genetically and impressively vulnerable to epidemics and climate change. And this uniformity, as I said, derives from powerful economic interests and legislative forces that were shaped by those holding corporate power. So we have experienced since, for example, the example of the famine in Ireland, because of the potato was destroyed by a pathogen because it was genetically homogeneous. The same happened in 1970 in the United States. There was a loss of corn production that resulted in a decrease of 13 million tons in just one growing season to another. And so we can see that our systems, the more genetically homogeneous they get, the more vulnerable they're going to be. And because they are so vulnerable, because they lack diversity, they lack ecological regulation processes, actually we have to inject into the biosphere, and this was in 2007, today is even more, about 5.2 billion pounds of herbicides, insecticides and fungicides into the biosphere, affecting all the biodiversity, having public health impacts. For example, in the United States, it is estimated that if we account for the impacts of pesticides on the environment and on public health, about $10 billion a year. But those are externalities that are paid by society in general. And also, because of the continuous use of the same chemicals over and over, we are having now populations of insects and diseases and weeds that are becoming resistant. There's more than 400 species of mites and insects that are resistant to more than 1,000 different insecticides. And if we look at South America, where there's more than 57 million hectares of soybean actually to be exported to the north to feed the cattle in the north, these systems are genetically modified soybean systems, what is called the Roundup Ready soy. And here in this picture, you can see all the brown is actually soybean ready to be harvested, but the rest are weeds that are resistant to Roundup. So actually, by the year 2006, there were about 12 species of weeds resistant to Roundup. And this gets farmers into a technological and pesticide treadmill. So despite the fact that we're injecting all these pesticides into the environment, and despite the fact that there's a lot of research going on pest management, annual crop losses caused by insect, weed diseases are estimated to be up to 40%. So we're still losing a lot of crops due to pests, and that obviously indicates the failure of this chemical technology. On the other hand, agriculture is very vulnerable to climate change, especially large-scale monocultures. We know that we're going to increasingly be experimenting severe droughts, extreme precipitation events, cluster flooding, heat waves. This is already happening in different parts of the world. Actually, 2023 was the warmest year ever detected. Average temperatures reach above 1.48 centigrade pre-industrial levels. But during 180 days, temperatures went above 1.5 degree threshold. And nor the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement, nor all the 27 COPs that we have had have stopped climate change. Actually, greenhouse emissions increased 65% since the country sat down for the first time to negotiate climate change. So in the Midwest of the US, for example, in 22, it was the worst drought ever experienced. Approximately 33% of corn production was lost, and this is mostly transgenic corn. And here you can see the trajectory, the 50-year trajectory of corn yield responding to different events. And you can see that this since the 2000, there have been some unusual climatic events that have dropped productivity in dramatic ways. So what is estimated by the year 2050 is that the maize yields in China, Brazil, France are going to decrease globally about 4%, and wheat about 5%. But it's going to depend on which country we're talking about and what area of the world, temperate or tropical environments. So in summary, monocultures may have temporary economic advantages for farmers, but in the long term, they do not represent an ecological optimum. The drastic narrowing of cultivated plant diversity in dominant monoculture is putting the world's food production at risk.
Dr. Altieri, if you could just slow down just a tiny bit just for our interpreters.
Okay.
Thank you.
So industrial agriculture that dominates 70 to 80% of the arable land injects 5.2 billion pounds of pesticides into the environment, uses 70% of the water, 80% of the fossil fuels, produces more than 30% of the greenhouse gases, warms the planet, creates conditions for pandemics, only produces 30% of the global food. And so we're depending on an agriculture that is not sustainable. You know, we have an agriculture that loses nutrients, degrades the soils, leaches chemicals into the environment, is susceptible to pests, kills pollinators and other beneficial fauna, is vulnerable to climate change, depends on fossil fuels and agrochemicals, and create conditions for the emergence of pandemics. So why is it that we continue with this type of agriculture? So basically, food production needs to increase sustainably, but what's going to happen is that we're going to have the same or less arable land base with less petroleum or more expensive petroleum, less water and nitrogen within a scenario of climate change, social unrest, and financial crisis. And this challenge of increasing sustainably food production in the future cannot be met with the existing industrial agricultural model and its biotechnological derivations. As Einstein said, you cannot solve the problem with the same mentality that created it. So we need a new paradigm. So we're looking for an agriculture that is going to be decoupled from fossil fuel dependence, agroecosystems that are nature friendly, that are resilient to climate change, that are multifunctional. Not only they produce food, they produce social, ecological services, they maintain cultures, gastronomies, etc. And they're the foundation of socially just local food systems. Because by the year 2030, 80% of the world population will live in cities, and cities of 10 million people are going to triple in numbers. And one city of 10 million people needs to import 6,000 tons of food per day, which travels about 1,000 kilometers. So that's totally unsustainable. We need local food systems. So we're looking for an agriculture that is high diversity, high efficiency, and high productivity, where we integrate crop, livestock, and trees, where there's high recycling rates and low dependence on external inputs. And this is where agroecology comes in as the science that will provide the principles in order to be able to design these agroecosystems that are going to be diverse, resilient, and they're not going to depend on inputs, but rather they're going to depend on ecological processes. Because agroecology really is a set of principles. It's not a set of techniques or practices. It takes the form of practices. The principles take the form of practices. And then these practices set in motion ecological processes, such as organic matter accumulation, nutrient cycling, biological pest control, water conservation, and all these processes are very important for improving plant health, soil fertility, resiliency, and sustainability. So for example, one principle is diversity, but diversity could be a rotation, but what kind of rotation will happen in one part of Canada or another depends on the socioeconomic and ecological conditions. But that practice of rotation reflects the principle of diversity and sets in motion processes such as breaking down organic matter, accumulating organic matter, nutrient cycling, breaking cycles of pests, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're talking about is the conversion of these large-scale systems that depend on inputs, pesticides, and that degrade the environment into systems that are agroecologically based, that are more diversified, that are more resilient, that don't depend on inputs, but that depend on ecological process. So it's much more information intensive, knowledge intensive. Farmers will need to know more about the ecology of their farms in order to design these new systems. And so in these stages of conversion, we usually, if we want to move from conventional monocultures to a more diversified farm, whatever scale, small scale, medium scale, large scale systems, we can go through different steps or different stages. The first one is IPM, which would be the use of chemicals. When you monitor a pest population, you establish a certain threshold of the disease or the insect pest or the weeds in the field. If that threshold is surpassed, then you need to spray. But because these are monocultures, you usually surpass those levels and always apply pesticides. So we call IPM intelligent pesticide management, basically. It's a good step, but it's not enough. The second step would be the input substitution, which is where most of organic farming falls, where you have farmers that basically change the package of technologies from chemical to biological or organic that are allowed by the certification. So here's a farmer in California that is ready to plant strawberries, orders the compost because he doesn't produce the compost, and then the company comes and sprays the compost, spreads the compost 10 tons per hectare, whatever. Then when you see the system is a monoculture, but it's an input substitution monoculture. And because it's a monoculture, you need inputs. In this time, they're not chemical inputs, but they're biological organic inputs. And here you see, for example, farm workers releasing predatory mites in strawberries to control the pest mites. And they have to do it every week, like an input. Or this vineyard in Chile where they produce, it's organic vineyard, and they have to spray about 18 different products. So the cost of production go up, and some products contradict with each other. For example, sulfur is used for controlling mildew, but then it kills beneficial insects that you have released previously. So these contradictions usually happen in the systems. So what we're talking about is moving beyond organic by creating systems that are based on ecological processes rather than inputs. And we use two pillars. One is soil organic management, and the other one is crop diversification. So soil organic management, what we're talking about is increasing organic matter in the soil and activating biologically the soil for nutrient cycling and soil fertility and plant health. And then crop diversification, which means breaking the monoculture through temporal and spatial arrangements of crops or integration of animals to better use resources, but also to enhance ecological processes like biological pest control. So the addition of organic matter, the first pillar, is very important because you improve the soil structure, you increase water infiltration, and also enhance biological activity of the soil. And it's very important, especially in dry areas, because for each 1% of increase in organic matter in the soil, you can actually store 16 to 17 liters of water per square meter, which means 170,000 liters per hectare. Very important in dry farming conditions. And actually, the long-term studies that have been done by Rodale show that when they were comparing corn and their conventional and organic management for 30 years, they found that always conventional corn had higher yields than organic in terms of kilograms per hectare, while the conditions were optimal. But when the drought comes, the organic systems actually are superior than the conventional systems. And this is due to several factors. One of them was organic matter, water holding capacity of organic matter, but also the activation of biological activity in the soil. Organic matter becomes kind of the energy source for a very complex food web of microorganisms, fungi and bacteria and nematodes and actinomycetes that are interacting. Some of them are phosphorus solubilization bacteria, or others are antagonistic against pathogens. And some of them, like this one, are mycorrhiza. Here you can see tomatoes of the same age, of the same variety, one with mycorrhiza, which are these fungi, and then this one is not. And this makes a whole difference when you are in drought conditions, because, for example, it is known that a root hair extends about 2 millimeters and absorbs water in a radio of 2 millimeters. But the hyphae of the fungi can extend biologically the root system in 40 times. So about up to 80 millimeters. This is very important for being able to solubilize phosphorus or to capture water in the soil profile. And also by engulfing the root, then the hyphae protects against pathogens. And there are many, many antagonistic microorganisms that are that are associated with the addition of organic matter into the system, such as, for example, actinomycetes, bacteria like Pseudomonas, fungi like Trichoderma or Gliocadium, which control a tremendous amount of very aggressive pathogens like Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and another species. And also, there are effects on insect pests depending on how you fertilize your crop. Research has shown that when you fertilize the crop, like wheat, with the same amount of nitrogen, but conventional, the fertilizers versus organic, you see an increase in populations of aphids. And this is related to a theory that was developed by a French scientist called Chabousseau, called the theory of trophobiosis, which says that when you apply so much nitrogen in the soil in the form of, for example, urea, highly soluble, the plant is not able to metabolize all the nitrogen into protein and amino acids. So there's a lot of free nitrogen in the foliage, which leads to an explosion of populations of aphids and other homopterans and even plant diseases. So by doing organic farming with a slow release of nitrogen, then you can actually have an effect on a damping effect on populations of pests and diseases. Well, the second pillar is the agroecological diversification, the breaking of monocultures through different strategies, genetic diversity, like variety mixtures, polycultures, intercropping systems, crop rotations, cover crops, crop livestock mixtures, agroforestry, increasing the diversity of hedgerows around the fields. There are many, many examples of strategies. For example, crop rotation in Brazil with a mixture of cover crops, and I think some farmers in Canada are using this technique. They grow the cover crops. Usually they have 7 or 8 species, but usually there's rye and probably lolium and Raphanus rapharistrum and Vicia villosa. And then they pass what is called the roll of faca, like a roller on this vegetation. It doesn't cut it, it doesn't incorporate it, kind of smothers it, leaves it as a carpet. And then on top of this mulch, they will plant their corn and their beans. This is usually done with animal traction or by hand, and there's no weeds, because as you smother the cover crop and it starts decomposing, species like rye and Raphanus raphanistrum and Vicia villosa have allelochemical compounds that start leaching into the soil, creating an allelopathic zone, a toxic zone in the first 2-3 centimeters, and all the seeds that are there, most wheat seeds, will die. If you plant your crop in that, also will die. So that's the farmers discovered that planting deeper, the corn and the beans, under the toxic layer, they were able to grow these crops and not using herbicides. And many farmers in the United States have basically, in my opinion, stolen the idea from these farmers in Brazil. They didn't compensate them or recognize them. But anyway, they developed these systems where they plant rye, a highly allelopathic crop. They have developed very sophisticated rolofacas or rollers, and then they plant the crops on this mulch without the need of herbicides. And so that would be kind of temporal diversity. The second type of diversity is increasing diversity in time and space in the same piece of land. One strategy is genetic diversity. This is something that was used in Eastern Europe, where farmers would mix different varieties of barley or wheat as a strategy to control diseases. And actually, a lot of research that was done back in Eastern Europe actually found that, for example, mildew levels were damped by, they were decreasing substantially when you mix varieties as opposed to when you have one variety that is susceptible. And there are different combinations of mixtures with monocultures, and you can see that in all cases, the populations of the disease decrease. Now, these kind of systems have been abandoned because of homogenization and loss of genetic diversity, etc. But it's a good strategy to deal with pathogens. The other strategy is intercropping, something that small farmers in developing countries have been doing for centuries, where they mix corn and beans or squash and many different plants all together. And these systems have been the laboratory of agroecologists. I mean, I was one of those in the 70s studying these systems, what happened with insect pest populations. But there's all kinds of interactions that happen above ground and below ground. And we have learned a lot from small farmers about agroecology. One of the things that we found when I was doing research on this is that when you mix different species, you have an incredible source of beneficial insects, because there are two theories that intercropping increases natural enemies, or intercropping actually interferes with the colonization of pests because they become lost in finding the main host. So you can see here that the abundance of pests is usually lower in polycultures than in monocultures, due to natural enemies or due to the fact that the crops become unapparent in these mixtures. The other thing is that when you increase crop diversity, you are able to reduce weed populations. You can see here, this is a corn-bean association. The weed population has been actually suppressed significantly. But if you take the beans out, then the niche becomes open and the weeds colonize. And there are studies that have been done in India and in many other places where that shows, for example, in this case, when you have a monoculture of sorghum, the wheat biomass is 1.73 tons per hectare. But when you include in the mixture cowpea, then the populations of weeds decreases about 4 times. And the yield of the sorghum increases compared to the monoculture. And then below ground in these intercropping systems, there's a lot of interactions happening, facilitation processes, resource sharing, complementarity, depending on the crops that you're mixing, plants that have different root depths and plants that produce different exudates. That leads to many interactions. One of them, for example, studies that were done in China, where they had monocultures of peanut or polycultures of corn and peanut. They found that when you combine the two crops, then there is solubilization of iron and zinc and copper and magnesium, which are very important micronutrients. But that solubilization only happens when you mix two crops, not when they are alone as monocultures. And this is due to the fact that plants exudate through the roots different compounds, organic acids, amino acids, enzymes, growth factors, phenolic acids, sugars, et cetera, and all these compounds promote positive interactions, such as increasing the growth of the plants, or antibacterial activity, antifungal activity, allelopathic interactions, et cetera, et cetera. So it is very interesting that when you measure the yields of these polycultures through what is called the land equivalent ratio, because you're overlapping two systems, you're growing corn over beans, then the way to calculate the yield advantages of polycultures is by using this formula where you use the yield of corn or any other crop in polyculture over the yield of corn in monoculture, plus the yield of bean in polyculture over the yield of bean in monoculture. And you get, for example, a value of 1.5. That means you need 1.5 hectares of monoculture to obtain the same yield in 1 hectare of polyculture, because the polyculture utilizes the resources of water and nutrients and sunlight, etc., more efficiently. So there's been many studies and what they call meta-analysis that have shown that when you compare diversified versus monoculture systems, you find that there are positive responses. The green means that there's a positive response, that the polyculture has advantages over the monoculture when it comes to soil fertility, crop yields, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, water regulation, pest control, biodiversity, pollination, et cetera, et cetera. The evidence is there. The diversified farming systems fare much better in all the different processes than monocultures. And actually, in the United States, after the Dust Bowl, the Dust Bowl, the Soil Conservation Service that was created at that time started promoting polycultures of, for example, barley protecting lettuce, or rye protecting cotton against wind erosion. Of course, these systems were not designed to promote other ecological processes, but the processes were happening. They didn't do research to find out what happened with insects and with weeds and with pathogens, but I'm sure that there were a lot of interactions that were missed because they didn't measure them. They were just interested in wind erosion reduction. And small farmers and medium-sized farmers in the Midwest, some of them still use strip intercropping systems. And research has shown, for example, the study of from 1982 to 85, they found that farmers were able to save $83 per acre by using the systems as opposed to monocultures, because actually you start promoting processes like soil fertility enhancement, breaking life cycles of pests. Actually, the corn could be serving as a barrier for the distribution of diseases, pathogens, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm going to show some examples from Colombia, where I'm working half of the year. This is a farm, a sugarcane farm in the Cauca Valley, where sugarcane actually is conventionally managed, except in this farm, where they grow, for example, sugarcane with cowpea as a green manure, and the cowpea fixes nitrogen. You can grow it because sugarcane lasts for about 12 months, then it closes around 5 months, so you cannot grow crops green manure, but you can introduce. So here you can see what happens with the cowpea. Then they cut it and then start decomposing, adding nitrogen to the system. And then when the canopy closes, then they bring the sheep that actually go inside the sugarcane, control weeds, add manure, and therefore close the nutrient cycles. And here you can see a little picture of a little movie of these animals that are being actually patrolled by a dog. Okay, so what is interesting is that, oh, I'm sorry, this is in Spanish, but basically what it's saying is that in this system, actually the efficiency of nitrogen use is very high. It's 2.7 tons of sugarcane per kilo of nitrogen, as opposed to the conventional ones that use chemical fertilizers that get 0.6 tons of cane per kilogram of nitrogen. So the efficiency is much higher, and basically after 3 years after the conversion to agroecological management, the production remains about 10 tons per hectare per month. The levels of organic matter in the soil went up to 4%. They actually are saving water, and they have to irrigate 50 to 60% less irrigation than the neighbors. The damage by pest is much lower, usually 6%, here is 1.5%. They have found more than 54 species of spiders and 28 species of ants in the sugarcane that control this pest. And there's a 40% in reduction in cost of production, which gives farmers the economic viability. You don't just make money by selling your products in the market, but by cutting cost of production in 40%, that makes your system very viable. There are also systems of animal management, cattle management, which we call the silvopastoral systems, which combine fodder plants, grasses, leguminous herbs, shrubs, trees for animal nutrition. And in these systems, actually, the animal condition improves, and the antibiotics are rarely actually utilized. So what we're talking about is the conversion of a pasture into kind of a forest, where you have the grasses with the shrubs and the trees. And here's leucaena being utilized, which is a tropical legume, but also this plant that looks like a sunflower is called Tithonia diversifolia in the more cold areas and the higher elevations. And what they have found is that you increase the animal carrying capacity from 1 to 5 per hectare, and milk production went from 1.7 liters to 4.1 per cow per day. And you can see here the rainfall actually changes with time, El Niño, La Niña, but the yields of the sugarcane remain around 10 tons per hectare, regardless of water regime, in dry years, in wet years. And all this is because of the organic matter content, the diversity of plants, all that helps in the resilience of the system. And just to summarize here, this is in Spanish, but basically it's saying that you need 40% less land. You actually increase production of milk 65% in less land, and you increase the number of animals 69%. So basically the principles that they're applying, the agroecological principles in animal production systems that are being applied are adopting management practices that improve animal health, decrease the inputs needed for production, decreases the pollution, enhances biodiversity within animal production systems, and preserves biological diversity. So we need to start changing also the metrics when we're evaluating agroecological systems. You know, when we have to stop thinking about kilograms per hectare, we need to think about kilograms per hectare of unit of water or unit of energy. We need to talk more about, instead of calorie production, nutrient content per hectare, or total output per hectare, instead of just the yield of one crop, because diversified farms produce many different things, so you get total output, resource efficiency, the ecosystem services delivered, livelihood resilience, and social equity. All these indicators have to be taken into consideration when we look at evaluate agroecological systems. So ecologizing the agricultural systems is not enough. It requires some deep ecological and political changes. We need to break industrial monocultures with agroecology. We need to dismantle the control of multinationals over the food system and the neoliberal policies that maintain such structure. And transforming the food system, therefore, will require a major shift from societies embedded in the market economy to a greater reliance on alternative food networks, reducing the distance between producers and consumers, ensuring that food is healthy and accessible to all people, not just the elite that can pay for the organic food, and that more wealth and jobs are created and retained within the rural communities. And for that, you know, we have these food empires that are controlling the food system. They determine what farmers are going to produce, with what technology, with what inputs, because they control the seeds and the chemicals and everything. And also, since they're vertically stratified through the huge supermarket chains, they determine what consumers are going to eat, the price of the food, and also the quality of the food. And what we need to do is create, as Van der Ploeg says, a bypass where we create agroecological territories and you create local markets where farmers and consumers get into solidarious type of relationships. There are money transactions, but the solidarity economy prevails. So these territorial markets, local and regional markets, are more flexible to respond to changes and perturbations. That you create multiple commercialization short-circuit channels for food sale and access. Therefore, there's less vulnerability to price changes and collapse of centralized supply chains, as it happened with COVID. And the territorial markets reduce the dependence of producers and consumers from large-scale corporations that control the global supply chains. So, but also, we cannot put all the weight of the change of the food system on the farmers, consumers, which we all are consumers. We need to understand that eating is both an ecological and political act, that when, as a consumer, we support local farmers, small farmers, instead of the corporate food chain, then we create socio-ecological sustainability and resilience in our communities. Therefore, consumers need to have an active participation in creating and strengthening local food systems, and we need to also pressure local and regional governments to support agroecological initiatives. And there are many producer-oriented policies that are being promoted in different countries in order to promote agroecology. Perhaps the most famous one is Brazil, that has a national law of agroecology, where the school lunch program, where 30% of the food that is served in the schools has to come from small farmers, and there are 2,000 municipalities that are participating, and more than 45 million students per day are being fed. So we need to scale up agroecology. It's possible, but we need positive actions, supporting farmer-to-farmer networks, funding more research and extension education, providing an enabling public policy environment, taking specific actions for empowering women and youth, and making a strategic alliance with social movements. That means that the academia, research institutions, and social movements, and obviously the participation of consumers. So the drivers of agroecological massification, first we need a crisis, which we have a polycrisis, so the motivation is there. Social organization is fundamental, because social organization and the social fabric are the growing medium in which agroecology advances. Networks of farmers and consumers for sharing experience and knowledge. Effective agroecological practices that work, mobilizing discourses, and favorable markets and policies. All that is very important. So, but the transformational change in agriculture must be accompanied by a shift from market economy to a solidarity economy, from fossil fuel to renewable energy, and from big corporations to cooperatives. Such new world should be led by allied social, urban, and rural social movements, aware that a change towards socially just and ecologically viable agriculture is critical today in the world. So with that, I finish my presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Altieri, for that very, very interesting presentation.